And we're live. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I'm here with the wonderful Blaine Lacrosse, otherwise known as Mad Economist.
Pleasure as always.
I'm getting an echo.
Oh no. Pleasure as always. Wait, you're getting an echo from me? Oh no.
No, it's from me. We're good. As usual, we are ironing out our technical issues with audio and video live, and so we rely on you guys to tell us whether or not it's okay. You guys are going to be the most picky about this stuff. Stream has an echo too. Yeah, it should be okay now though. I think I fixed it. So what we're going to do today, once we double check that everything is good for audio and video, is we are going to be having a discussion about MDAQS, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is. But if anybody hasn't seen it, Jude from Headphone posted a video where he does an interview with Dr. Geerlich about this, and that's linked in the description. And there's also a video from
Three video series.
a video series. Yeah, the first one is linked as well from the Head Acoustics folks. And so if you guys are interested to learn more about this, outside of what we discuss here, check that out. As usual, I'm going to give the shout out to, headphones.com for all of our stuff. If you want articles from us, that's up there on headphones.com, as well as check out our Discord, also linked in the description. And for any of our measurement related stuff, if you're looking for additional information on various products, check out the forum linked below as well. But I figure we can just get right into it and start talking about what this is. Afterwards, we can dive into Q&A and talk about a few more subjects. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this because I find it to be very interesting in general, like in concept. However, I think we both actually have some scruples, some commentary.
I think we both have scruples. I'd hope.
yes. We have potentially some issues with it, but I also want to mention that I believe that what was shown in that interview isn't all there is to it. I think there's misgivings is probably the right word. I just want to note that there's likely to be more to it than what's been discussed so far, and so look forward to future videos, I imagine, on the subject. But I wanted to first kind of just, I guess, start by talking about what this is, right? It's called MDAQS, and that means multidimensional audio quality score.
Yep.
Essentially, if I understood this correctly from Jude's interview with Dr. Geerlich and from the
okay,
other
hold
video.
on. Listeners lying in our Discord.
Listeners, stop lying on our Discord.
He said that we had Sean here. We don't have Sean this week.
No, we may have Sean next week. We're working on that. So first let's talk about MDAQS, what it is, to the best of my ability, because it's a bit of a complicated thing. And the more I, learn about it, I feel like the less confident I am in what it is. But from my perspective, it is, as summarized by Dr. Geerlich in that video from Jude, the idea going from a physical acoustic measurement to a perceptual measurement. That's sort of how he summarized it. And I think of this as kind of like an index score that is based on, human listening rather than an index score based on acoustic data. Is that a fair characterization, or would you say that it requires a little bit more nuance?
I mean, if you would describe the Harman predicted preference
Yes.
rating in the same way, then yes.
Yeah.
I would consider them to be basically equivalent in that respect.
Yeah.
There's differences, and they're interesting differences to talk about in how they derived them, but they are both, they're both taking a body of listening tests and a set of measurements and saying, here's the correlations we have. We'll throw some mild machine learning at figuring out correlation coefficients, and we'll say, okay, that's predicted.
Right. So, I've perhaps incorrectly, but also perhaps correctly, characterized this as, in the past, as if you think about like the statistical model that predicts listener preference from Harman, this is instead a perceptual model that predicts listener preference, or something along those lines. Is that fair?
Is this the same guy as the angry economist? Who is the angry economist, chat? Anyway. I am not the
you're
angry
being sucked
economist.
into the chat
I'm
wormhole.
sorry, they're asking who I am. Anyway,
Okay. Well, Blaine Lacrosse is the voice of reason and science behind many audio reviewers. um,
yeah,
for those who
I'm
aren't
where
aware.
people outsource nerd stuff too.
Exactly. So we've certainly learned a lot through his help.
So, I mean, I would not say that it's more perceptual than PPR, right? Because
Right.
PPR is based on a series of listening tests, right? Where they said, rank these headphones on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 or whatever it was. And then they compensated for people never using the full range of the scale, right? So even the worst headphone isn't a 1. People maybe say the worst is a 4 or a 6. But they just expanded that back to cover the 100-point scale, and then they made a model that was based on that.
Right.
The MDAQS score used a different methodology to get their listening test results, but ultimately it is just saying what's the correlation of the measurements we have with the listening test results. So it's pretty much the same.
So, right. It has been framed as going beyond frequency response, but really what that is to me is instead going beyond target adherence or target compliance. And I don't think that it diminishes the importance of frequency response. So, I think a lot of people may read that and think, oh yeah, there's probably other metrics that we need to be considering because I hear things in audio that I can't explain by looking at frequency response. But that doesn't mean that it's not frequency response, essentially, is kind of where I'm at with it.
So do you mind if I share my screen?
Potentially.
Oh, fair enough.
No, go ahead.
So this is their block diagram.
It's definitely
of
screwed up
MDAQS,
our.
right?
Hold on.
So they take a set of input data, it's a mixture of music sweeps, they pre-process it, and then there are 3 scores that make up the total MDAQS score, which are timbre, which is all FR, analysis distortion, which is mostly FR, and analysis immersion, which is mostly FR.
Right. Now that's exactly what I'm thinking of here in this when I say that it's not that it's anything really like for these particular things. It's not like it's anything in like a separate metric other than at least for the acoustic stuff other than the frequency response. Now I have to do this again. God damn it. But
That problems.
because we understand things like timbre and immersiveness. I think we can. At least this would be my argument. We can understand timbre and immersiveness in terms of frequency response.
So that's not entirely what it sets out to do, although in practice that's a lot of what it does.
Right.
And I'm not sure how we want to approach this. Do we want to drill into what the MDAQS score is as it's been explained? And I should note that while I have read Schaefer's paper on it and I have watched other presentations on it, I wasn't involved in its creation, and obviously they don't put their proprietary stuff in the papers. So some of what I'm saying is, conjecture or this seems to be linked in this way.
Sure. If you want to drill down on that, I also want to circle back to why I find it conceptually very interesting.
I think maybe we should start there and then go into drilling, because drilling down will immediately lose us half our viewership.
Okay, sure. So why I find it conceptually interesting, there's 2 reasons. One is I think Jude's worry about frequency response, in particular target compliance and deviation, not being descriptive enough of the experience is a worthwhile concern to have, especially for the average person, right? I think that things maybe get a little bit different when we talk about people who are deep into the measurement weeds, right? And I really do think that if I hear if many of us who are in the chat as well, if we hear something that is too forward at 3 kilohertz, we're able to identify that. I think that's true. But for the average person, probably not. And so, a graph, specifically, target adherence and compliance, without the rest of, the required knowledge and context for that, I share that worry that Jude has about it not being descriptive enough. And I think this is also one of the things that was raised by Dr. Gierlich in the interview as well. Or I suppose agreed upon. So that's the one reason I'm interested in something like this, right? Maybe I don't know if it's this exactly, but I think it's good if we can figure out a way to have either a more nuanced view of frequency response or a wider, broader sense to draw from, right? And I think this seeks to accomplish that. The other reason why I find it conceptually interesting is this weirdly, at least if I understand it correctly, fits with some of my my wheelhouse in perceptual theory. It squares with sort of the dominant, or doing something like this would square reasonably well if anybody were to draw the connection to the dominant perceptual theories of representational mental content, and how for all of us good externalists, which is a position to have in philosophy, that many of us sort of by default I think intuitively have. It means that there's agreement between, or there's a good fit between those two theories. So in that case, it's that mental content is representational content, and that content is physically something. And in this case, we could talk about whatever's going on at the eardrum. At least whatever's going on at the eardrum. We could also talk about the effect on the nerve and all the rest of the stuff. But whatever's going on mentally, as representational content, right? There's something it is like to experience good sound, let's say. That is a physical thing that is causing that. And so what's cool about this to me is that it looks at that. It basically goes from one to the other in a way that doesn't have any layers in between. And so from my perspective, even though I don't know enough about the specifics, and I do have misgivings, and we can get to that, I think a model like this is at least interesting to explore. But that's really kind of where I'm at with it. So maybe we can now dive into some of the deeper stuff.
So, I guess just to sort of get a sense from you, like, do you find that to be, and I think we covered this in the introduction, but maybe I'm misunderstanding how you're framing it now. Do you find that to be different from what, for example, Sean Olive did with with his predict preference rating score?
I find the framing of it slightly different, but I suppose the philosophical aspect of it could be thought of in a similar way, because it is, again, it's looking at listener preference, and it's based on listening tests. But I think with Sean's, what I actually like about Sean's is that they're trying to, I mean, it's a way of looking at what the outcomes are for real human preference, and saying, hey, this is what the data result is. Here's the acoustic result of that. Depending on the cluster that you're looking at, you can have a different one, but you get the idea. And to me, that's almost more compelling, only because I feel that we would be in a better place when it comes to understanding what good is if we're able to identify these things in frequency response. So where I see the difference is more in terms of the nuance of what frequency response might contribute to, like, for example, descriptions of timbre and immersiveness, given that the frequency response is presumably a factor in those things.
Right. So you like that it has subscoring, basically. That
Yeah.
It's not just creating a single aggregated goodness score, but rather that it broke it down into a lower level of what are people describing things as, and then did the correlation between that and their overall how good are things score.
Which fits with, I think, their intent of making things more, finding a more descriptive way of doing this. Where things kind of break down for me, though, is in a sense, again, unless there's more to this than I'm understanding, which probably is, but I think you still have the private language problem, because how do we know that when we're thinking of immersiveness, we're all thinking about it the same way, and the same thing with timbre. I also assume that this stuff goes a little bit broader than just the way that maybe audiophiles think of it. Um, but you know, like I think maybe there's more to immersiveness than just the perception of soundstage in the audiophile sense. But I don't know, right? So that's really where my two misgivings are. You know, one is that I think that if you look at frequency response, you know, I've long said that there's more to what the effect of that is on, you know, perception of things than strictly target adherence and compliance. Certainly when it comes to goodness, but I still think that we could potentially look at various different regions of the frequency response and say this contributes to soundstage, right? Or this relationship for these ranges may contribute to a better reception for timbre and things like that. And where I don't see MDAQS going, I mean, again, maybe they do, but I haven't seen that yet, is reinterpreting the outcomes into something acoustic like that, if that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense.
So, I mean, if they have a model that scores something based on, and they do, like part of there's a couple of parts of the immersiveness thing that are scored based on frequency response. If they have a model of what FR characteristics affect perception of immersiveness, then they by necessity are also, you know,
right,
modeling.
But totally. So I assume that
Like,
they have that. It's just that the
projecting
output
that
isn't
relationship back onto
yeah.
human perception. I'm not sure if so like I don't know if there's a distinction there to me in maybe I'm taking you the wrong way. Like the distinction you have here is that they're not just trying to say deviates from plot at this point, therefore sounds this way, or am I misreading it?
I'm merely thinking that if you have a consistent result for, let's say, immersiveness, it'd be cool to see what that actually is.
So there's confounding variables here, which is something we'll go into a little bit. But I mean, to some degree, what they've done here is found a bunch of things that correlate to perception to some extent and then given them names, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which wasn't, I mean, and this is always what happens when you try to create, you know, variables for this sort of analysis. And this is one of the real problems with causal inference, is that you're looking for a variable that's a proxy for, you know, whatever the real effect you want, which is probably hard to measure because they almost always are hard to measure. So you go looking for it and you find something that was like, oh, there's a credible account of how this might connect, right? The problem from my point of view with MDAQS as a whole for headphones, to be clear, is that while we know that all of the subscores of MDAQS correlate well with the total score, it's not entirely clear that that's not just because they're basically all primarily focusing on frequency response in the headphone case. So, I do want to delineate, MDAQS makes a lot of sense to me as a car audio evaluation system. But for headphones, from my point of view, what it amounts to is filtering frequency response through approximately 11 different holes and then putting it back together, which, you know, is an interesting effort. And there are cases where your MDAQS score would be bad, but or worse, not bad probably, but where your FR would be good, but your MDAQS score would be not as good. But it would be basically if you had high harmonic distortion. Like that's the only other thing that you're likely to encounter in a headphone that isn't actively defective that MDAQS scores for, that isn't just either A, broadband matching to their target, or B, specific features of specific frequency ranges.
Right. So in a situation like the HD800S, for example, right, there does seem to be something about those characteristics of frequency response that contribute to, you know, wider, broader soundstage or whatever, right? But we also think of them.
It might be.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just say, let's imagine that it is for a moment, right?
Hmm.
And there's some correlation for other headphones with those features as well, and that quality. Um, Anecdotally, let's just say. But we also recognize those characteristics to be deviations from from common targets, whether we're talking about ours or Harman. It's like those are things that if you were to take an EQ lens to this, you would try that out. You would try filling in the dip and dropping the 6K peak and so on. But does what's going on with the immersiveness aspect of MDAQS, and maybe you already answered this, but in your mind, does it leave room for an interpretation of frequency response where those FR characteristics are more positively received despite the fact that they deviate from common targets?
That's a good question. And to some degree here I have to speak conjecturally because at least Schaefer's paper doesn't, to my read of it, give you sufficient data on how immersion analysis is conducted to actually say for certain. It mentions that there are basically analyses of delta in the upper mid range specifically because that's a localizationally important band.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that it would be capable of giving a higher score to the HD 800 in that respect than its FR would imply otherwise. You
Like
could
if you were to compare it
certainly,
to the statistical model.
well, the statistical model doesn't rate spaciousness,
No,
right?
I know, but
But there is really, if we go to, and this is where I'd really recommend people watch. I think it was Schaefer in the first video and Jacob Sundergaard in the second video. Um, they have quite good presentations on how these things work on Head's YouTube channel. But they have a couple of elements which are not just how much does this differ from the target response, right? One of those is looking at a spectrogram of, well, it's just a corellogram
oh
of
yeah.
different, basically the panning effectively, and when sounds arrive relative to where they're supposed to.
And this is where it
Which,
makes more sense for speakers and car audio potentially.
yeah, so that one doesn't make any sense at all for headphones. But it does make a ton of sense for car audio because in car audio you're often in a scenario where one of your tweeters is just massively time delayed relative to another, and that's going to be a really bad spatial experience. So it makes sense in that capacity, but for headphones, there isn't really a mechanism for that to happen.
Right. Right.
And my understanding of their analysis of FR used in spatiality is that it's basically just the the math they are currently using would not be able to say the HD 800 has a better sound stage than the HD 600, for example, if the 600 better matched their target.
So that, I mean, if if you ran this by a bunch of audiophiles who've heard both, that may cause some issues.
Yeah, I think that would be an unpopular take.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like as it goes with this whole system, the outputs that have that we well that I know about already so far, um, I get the sense that a bunch of them really would not square with general audiophile consensus on those headphones. I think one of them being AirPods Max was very highly rated or scored well, right? From my understanding,
Well,
better
we
than
don't
many other
actually
ones.
we don't know how well it scored because they didn't actually have like
This is
at
based
least
on
I saw
yeah, this is based on
on
what you
Judy's
told
rate.
me at one of the conferences.
Well, yeah, the thing I would ask there is like, what were the other headphones that were included in the sample set? Like, I know they had the Empyrean, but I don't know if they had any.
Yeah,
Um, I don't want to say good headphones. Any strongly target compliant headphones?
you can say that. See, yeah, and that's fair. If I remember, I do believe that the stealth was included, or I guess listener told me that it was, or when he was describing it. But um,
I mean, it could have been.
it could have been, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I that one I don't know because I've watched both the presentations and I've seen the medals in the chat. This
What's up?
become what is detail.
This is the forever problem, man.
uh, yeah, I mean, so I think that if you wanted to, you could modify this to include some parameter of like, we think that this variable correlates with more spaciousness. Um, but that does not seem to be what the math currently
Hmm.
does.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, I guess it depends. And one of the big questions with all the spaciousness stuff and with the distortion as well is because these have a large component of just the frequency response, it's not surprising that they correlate with the overall score, but how much of that is just that they have a large, like they already
Hmm.
have a large dose of what we know correlates with the overall score.
Yeah, so it's like
Um,
you don't necessarily know where the outcome of if the outcome would be sufficiently different, you know, um, if you
well,
just went
it's
on
it's
what
like if
we
I
already
was
know.
testing a new painkiller, but I cut my placebos with Tylenol.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's
yeah, 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 yeah. That's a great way of describing it. Yeah. Now I'd be curious what if they have an answer to that because again like for me this is mostly interesting in concept, in part because I feel I don't know enough about the specifics and I think that's yet to come. But the other is I feel that the outcomes don't necessarily they don't grok with my sort of intuitions, I suppose, in some cases, and I feel like that's going to be the case for a number of folks, for many people as well. Um, so for me, it's more like looking forward. Does this type of evaluative tool make sense to accomplish the goal of a more nuanced or more descriptive analysis that is still based on FR, like at its core, and just so that again to go back to the idea of other metrics, which I think this is sort of framed as. When they do talk about time information and stuff like that. That's not specifically to do with headphones, except in rare cases, right?
well,
Um,
slightly more accurately, we can predict for any headphone that's minimum phase the impact it will have on the timing of things, the phase
mm-hmm,
relationships, by its frequency response, its magnitude frequency response.
mm-hmm,
The cases where a headphone is not minimum phase, either one, it's heavily distorted, like really heavily distorted, and it's not minimum phase because it's not linear,
mm-hmm.
or two, something is very wrong.
Right,
Like you could make a non-minimum phase headphone by crossing over multiple drivers, but it would sound horrible.
right,
Um, which I'm not going to say no one's ever done it. I think that I can actually think of a headphone that shows some of the characteristics that it might in fact have been done that way.
right.
But I'm
So
not
what
sure
we're
that's
talking about though is like in ordinary cases with, I mean, certainly, I actually don't know if this is true, but I expect most of the headphones that have been run through it already, that's not a variable that would have a particularly meaningful impact.
yeah.
Um,
The only one that would probably be an exception there potentially is the AirPods Max if there was
yeah, that's
some
what I was
sort of
wondering about.
spatialization algorithm going on.
Yeah.
But that would actually make it more likely that it would score worse, not better, because their score is basically a score about the fidelity of that spatial information.
Mm-hmm.
So something that perfectly matched their target and was minimum phased would have no distortion there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I
A headphone that perfectly
right.
matched their target, that is.
So to get back to to the question though, which is, do you see value in this sort of you know idea, to get a more nuanced or descriptive score? I mean, in this case, it's a score, but it could be anything, right? Or do you think that that's not even necessary?
I think that there's a lot of value to particularly to lay users, which is what this is heavily designed for, right? Like Gerlich was very keen to stress this. I think that Schaefer also fairly strongly stressed this. These are metrics that were made using untrained listeners aimed at you're a normal person who wants to buy something.
Mm-hmm.
How do you avoid getting a car that sounds horrible, right? Because like, and again, I think it's really important to remember head comes from car audio, right? Like
Right.
that's their hats were made for testing in cabin noise and car audio systems. They are extremely good at it. I think MDAX is a really great score for that, and I think that all of the things included in it make a ton of sense for that.
Mm-hmm.
With headphones, it's I mean, I think it's interesting, right, to add more variables and to see how they affect the correlation with your results. Um,
Well, there is a sense in which we already, as you just described, it's if you're thinking about like, okay, this is a way to for normal people to determine, that they're not buying a piece of junk. Um, that already exists in the Harman model, right? To a certain extent, it's just
yeah,
the critique, I think, or I suppose the nuance that they're trying to inject into this, maybe with the specific intention of bringing it over to headphones, is that people don't necessarily use the Harman model that way. um, they don't, they don't use it as that kind of, as Sean put it, guideline. Rather, it gets used as strict target adherence and deviation as a measure of good.
well, I very rarely see people actually using the statistical model. Like a lot of people are
Mm.
just eyeballing the overlay of a plot.
Right, but I think that the issue, yeah, that's certainly true. But I think the issue with the common interpretation of the statistical model is not to treat it as a statistical model, but rather to treat it as a measure of good for me or bad for me. When in reality it should be treated as statistically, this is what most people are going to like, right?
Yeah,
Um,
likely to be preferred versus
yeah,
unlikely,
likely
or
to be
more
preferred.
likely to be
Yeah,
preferred.
exactly, right. And I think the issue isn't so much that or the model itself, but rather the common interpretation of what that means, um, and to try and find a more nuanced system, I suppose, that avoids that interpretation, or avoids a you know misinterpretation of that sort of thing, is certainly interesting. Um, do you So apart from the idea that like we don't necessarily know if it's because of their more nuanced modeling, or if it's just because that's what that the results would have been fairly normal for their frequency response for what we know people like in the first place. Do you have any other sort of misgivings about MDAX as a thing to include? Let's say.
I mean, so the only misgiving I would have about MDEX, well, you mean like for us? Would we want to start doing MDEX?
Or just anybody who, like, from an evaluative theory perspective.
I think so. MDAX is on what is currently published meaningfully less validated than Sean's models. Like Sean's statistical models have a reasonable amount of published data that supports that they are actually predictive of user preferences.
Right.
We don't have that for MDAX yet. I would not be at all surprised if that exists internally at Head Acoustics, and I wouldn't be entirely surprised if someone publishes on this in the future. Until that time, it's not clear how confident we could be in an MDAX score,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, particularly in the case, as said, of headphones, where the traits that make MDAX distinctive are less or not significant. Like, so I would probably say that if you're going to have a flagship score, you want to come up with the should you buy this score. I would recommend using the PPR over MDAX just on that basis.
Mm.
I don't think that I would really recommend using either of them as a should you buy this score. Um, Neither of them are really intended for that, honestly. So, at least from my point of view. So I think that having that data published is not harmful so long as people take any of these scores as one only as predictive as your personal weighting of values correlates with the people who are involved, and only as predictive as they're validated to be, which is meaningfully in the case of the PPR score, and probably meaningfully, but we don't know that for a fact, in the case of MDAX. So I would say it's fine, but I would take it with a grain of salt, would be the main thing. I mean, you should take any
Mm-hmm.
scoring metric with a grain of salt because it always, by necessity, assumes quite a bit.
Right. Do you think Jude's concept about using this score as a way to show something that injects a little bit of additional humanity into a headphone evaluation is, well, first of all, do you think it's actually doing that in a way that is meaningfully better than what we already have from Sean's work? And then the second is, do you think that doing that in the first place is a worthwhile thing, or trying to do that? Because again, these things could always be refined and changed and so on.
Well, when we say humanity, what do we mean?
I suppose that, to me at least, it goes back to the idea of the perceptual, going from the acoustic measurement to the perceptual measurement, right? Where, and again, this is not to say that that's not what Sean's work is in a way, but but the idea of basically taking that perceptual aspect and making it more sophisticated, at least in theory, and then using that as a way to say, okay, here's like the target compliance aspect of things, which again is, of course, based on listener preference as well, but here is a let's say more sophisticated score that is based on human listening. Because
the question is this better at matching human perception?
Well, the way I see it is like, as far as what goes into it, we may be talking about similar things here, right? As you've pointed out, but at the same time, what we interpret, or what we like, how we read this stuff when we're looking at headphone evaluations or product evaluations, may be very different. So that's, I guess, the question is do you think that there's merit in providing this additional thing for the stated purpose of injecting a little bit more humanity into it, or do we need to look at something else for that?
I think that if I was going to try to do a humanized audio measurements thing, I would not start with MDAQS, not for headphones. For car speakers, I think that there is a good case for it. The fact that it has, from my memory, even a factor for noise makes a lot of sense for that application.
Mm-hmm.
It would surprise me if you saw, like, to the extent which it diverges from PPR's predictions, it would pretty much surprise me if that wasn't a case of it being more erroneous. Like, I would expect that it would correlate less with human perception than PPR if they differ.
So like in a situation where you have a really high MDAQS score and a really low PPR score.
Which I'm not sure is possible.
Right.
It depends on the target they use.
Yeah.
But if they are capable of differing, and if the headphone or whatever is not grossly distorted, which won't be factored in PPR, or using an extremely strange DSP, it would surprise me somewhat if MDAQS was more correct, simply because we have a meaningfully larger study in the form of Ola's work. Now, there is a reasonable thing to be asked, which is, was his experimental design as good as the MDAQS experiments? And there's an interesting thing: they didn't actually do their listening tests the same way, which may have resulted in a better overall result. But from what is published, I would be really uncomfortable making that claim. I would really want to see some of the results of listening tests correlated with MDAQS that weren't part of the training data, because there is a pretty big risk with these things that you just end up overfitting your training data too much.
Right. Okay. We just made me think of something, but when let's step outside of the hardcore measurements focused side of things for a moment and think about like the, I guess, traditional audiophile interpretations of sound quality, or let's take Crinical's tonal technical dichotomy concept and run with that for a moment. I mean, you and I think, well, certainly you, and I'm on getting there, is we sort of look at this stuff as potentially being frequency response at the eardrum, as explaining why there are things that we hear that we can't identify in the graph, and vice versa, things that we see in the graph that we don't hear.
And I do want to push a little back on things we see in the graph that we don't hear, because that makes a lot of assumptions about how we hear relative to the graph.
Sure, like, yeah, totally. But the point there is more that this stuff is very likely to be in frequency response, and that the analysis of it is or let's say the consideration of it in the conditions that we see it in, right, is limited. Let's just say. I think a lot for what a lot of people may want out of MDAQS or something like it, right, in concept, is a more complete picture of those qualities, foregoing any actual acoustic data that they may see, and rather say, okay, well, this one is better received for X, Y, and Z that we may think of as, that we may interpret as, whatever audiophile qualities, that we could then get a more predictive result for some of the products that we have heard, or that and it would rate very highly, despite the fact that they're not target compliant. And I don't know that that's necessarily what the outcome is here, and I don't think that it could be. But I want to get your sense on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, like if the question is, is MDAQS a measure that is, I would suspect, correlated with perception of headphone soundstage, like its spaciousness,
Yeah, but
imaging or any other
detail, slam, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, it would surprise me substantially if MDAQS produced a higher correlation with that than general target adherence, which isn't to say that it's going to have a negative correlation or that it's not going to correlate well. It probably will.
Mm-hmm.
Although, so an idea that was advanced to me a long time ago, and it's one that I've gotten to take more seriously as time goes by, I've noticed that a lot of people are prone to focus on ostensibly technical elements of tonally bad headphones.
What do
not
you mean
universally.
by that? What's the example of that?
Abyss.
Technical elements of tonally bad headphones.
Like people will say, oh, the tonality is bad.
Oh, yeah,
Man,
okay, sure.
It has incredible slam and detail.
Sure.
And I can't help but wonder if some factor of that is just when the sound is altered like that, it changes what you notice.
Oh, I've thought that for such a long time.
Yes.
Yeah. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your perception is somehow fooled. It's like you are actually hearing those things.
No, and that's why generally what these indexes are trying to do isn't to say how accurate is this headphone. It's actually kind of interesting that there is an element in this which is accuracy based, the corellogram.
Yeah.
But the majority of it isn't saying how accurate is this. They're saying how much does the aspects of what we measure correlate with things that we're saying sound good to people.
That we like.
Or that people are saying sound good to them.
Yeah.
And that's, it's the same with the Harman stuff, right? Like Sean's work over a lot of papers looks at, is this variable correlated with listener preference among headphones? And the answer has been, for most things that aren't frequency response, no. For things that are frequency response, yes, overwhelming. Which doesn't mean that it covers everything, right? Like it's not a perfect model. I mean, no model is perfect, but the Harman predictive model is particularly imperfect. But it does mean that what we're mostly focusing on is the question of how can we take a set of measurements and say this is likely to be preferred for listening to music by humans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It has a parallel to, and this is something that Gerlich draws in his interview with Jude, to speech intelligibility indexes, right? Like speech intelligibility indexes are common for telecommunications protocols, they're common for rooms, and it's just about how much the alterations that are, well, not the alteration, I mean, like, me speaking in a room has a speech intelligibility variable, right? Like a room that is highly echoic, I'm going to be less intelligible talking to you than in a more dead room. Which is why conference rooms are typically more deadened. So, and they came up with these basically just based on, what can we actually correlate with people's actual reported subjective experiences here? And sometimes you build tests like, can people differentiate two similarly sounding words and what changes things on that factor, right?
We're back to Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
At a certain point.
At the end of the day, we're always talking about people's internal experiences in a way that's very hard to crack open without invasive brain surgery.
But, there is the paper you shared with me a while ago from Thiel. There is an interesting element to, I mean, the psychoacoustics thing. There is an element to this stuff where if the end result is, X thing is more preferred despite its various, flaws, I think it'd be interesting to figure out why, you know?
Well, and flaws are relative, right? Like, what is
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
like some people like the naive interpretation of headphone measurements is a non-flat raw FR is a flaw, right? Like
Hmm.
it's changing the response of the input signal, which is a voltage. Now, obviously, we prefer that because we have ears, which are also not flat signal.
Hmm.
But flaw is very much a subjective commentary, and it depends on what we want. And usually, what we say we want is something that sounds good.
Right. It's figuring out what good that's the nebulous bit.
Well, yeah, and what variables influence good, and whether those variables are always constructive in their in their interactions with each other. Like, there's a scenario where there are traits, and I don't want to say this is true, but there is a scenario where, say, having a couple of spikes in the treble or something that happen to be at localization bands gives us more sense of space and airiness,
Hmm.
um, while pushing us away from the preferred,
Hmm.
the basic preferred frequency response. And it might well be that they are perceived as damaging the timbre of the sound. I don't think that's probably the case, but it might be.
Hmm.
There's a scenario where that's true. And in that scenario, you might have the same preference score with one thing that was just closer to target and one thing that was more spatial.
Right. Oh, and so it could be for different reasons that people preferred it, or that the preference score ends up being the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, that's both fascinating and also to think about, right? But also, it's kind of part of what Jude was talking about with, preferring to, having a personal sort of preference index for two different headphones that sound nothing alike and liking them, for different reasons. But I think of this more along the lines of like, there's no guarantee that what we're paying attention to is the same thing, or the things that we are considering as good is the same thing either. Um,
Although
you
there
know,
is reason to believe that because people have pretty strong correlations on what they prefer.
like
Like,
for frequency response, or for, well, I'm going back to the abyss thing, right? Where it's like it's making you notice more things given it's so far out of whack in various different things, and people, because of that, they're going, oh, there's things in the music that I never heard before, but maybe it's not that. It's actually just that it's those specific nonlinearities that are making them go, oh, that's a weird thing there that I hadn't paid attention to before, and that gets interpreted as good, versus timbrally more appropriate things, for example.
hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like, we know in the factors that we know how to measure the correlation with perceived sound quality, we know that there's pretty wide agreement. There are
Hmm.
variations, and they are meaningful, but we do know that there's pretty strong clustering. Like, there's only a fairly small population of people who will really like a headphone that I find abhorrent from a Harman PPR thing. The For the other
I was thinking
things,
of The
for the
Expanse for a
last,
second.
well, I mean, the Expanse is an interesting one
Yeah.
because, like, it's a headphone that measures a bit differently on different rigs. And I think that's one that I'd really like to explore, looking a little bit more deeply into that. And it's something where I'm really hoping to get more ears involved in general. Um,
DMS's 4128 measurement's very interesting, actually.
oh wow, that's interesting as well.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that he had measured it, but yeah,
Yeah.
that would be fantastic to see that along
It
with
measures
51.
closer to how we hear it, or at least how I hear it, and I think you hear it similarly to how I hear it.
I heard it is very harsh.
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
Probably unpalatably harsh.
Yeah.
I mean, you remember I sat there and spent like
You were
30
comparing
minutes.
the 400 SE to the Expanse.
Well, not just that. I spent like I spent like half an hour or so trying different things and be like, oh, is it that it has nonlinear response with at very low levels for some reason, like Constantine suggested. I spent listening to it, and immediately made me say, okay, well, there's something that I'm perceiving that this measurement does not seem to imply. Let's look for it.
Yeah. Let's figure out what that is.
Hmm.
Which is kind of, I mean, that brings us a little bit back to why I titled this, like the future of headphone reviews and new ways to measure headphones, because MDAQS is one thing, but it relates to kind of the larger scale project that we're working on as well, which is to provide additional on head data, or different condition data for the same headphone. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that for folks who don't necessarily know why we're doing that, because it seems like there's still a confusion around what's the benefit of doing this, showing the same headphones measured across multiple rigs, when we have the Gross 43AG already with all kinds of good data on the Gross 43AG as far as what we know people prefer.
Well, and one thing I want to start with on that one, and it's interesting because some people, I think, perceive this as contrary to Olive's work, but this is an area where Olive is actively involved, and it's an area where his work documents some of the factors that we're hoping to look more into. When we say, X headphones response is more preferred, what we mean is Sean Olive had a virtual listening test methodology, right? So he had a thing where they would equalize a certain headphone to be flat or whatever, and then they would EQ it to match, the LCD2, the HD800, whatever. So we know what's preferred out of HD800 EQ'd to match, LCD2, Empyrean, Abyss, whatever, all of the things in his studies. We don't actually have nearly as robust of a body of data of the actual preference of those headphones. And that's deliberate. Like it's deliberate because some of those headphones were quite variable in how they were on people's heads. And what Sean sought to find out here wasn't which is better between the Dan Clark Audio Stealth or Expanse and the HD800. It was, what do people prefer as an aspect of headphone sound? So he was controlling for that variable. But the thing is, as people who actually have to buy and wear headphones, we actually have to contend with that variable, because we actually wear the headphones, not just emulated versions of them played back on the HD800. Except for me. That's what I do.
Yeah. Well, and in your case, it's going to be less variant than other things that would, like an Expanse potentially.
Yeah, but although it does still vary meaningfully. Yeah. Like I replaced my pads recently, and it changed the bass level quite substantially, even though I don't have a terrible coupling, just because it was getting worse because they were getting worn out.
Right.
And I've completely forgotten where I'm going with this.
Oh, the idea of
multiple years. Yes. Right. So another of those variables is, of course, we don't have the exact same pinna, right? In fact, I don't even have two of the exact same one myself. As a matter of fact, most people don't. They're a little bit asymmetrical. Please don't take that screenshot from that video, by the way. I'd really like to not see my pinna on Reddit.
Someone's gonna model that, for perfect MadBot, compliance.
I really hope you're wrong. And they'll interact differently, right? Like in a free field, that's just your HRTF for a given incidence, right? Yeah. Like that's why if you cut off my ears and replace them with your ears, your outer ears, your pinna, I would have a hard time locating sounds in space, and everything would sound tamberly wonky to me, at least initially.
Yeah, until you got used to it.
Yeah. And people do sleep a bit on how significantly we get used to it. It's actually quite incredible.
Yeah. This is just for the record. We're not doing that experiment.
We're not cutting off Andrew's ears yet. Yet. But headphones also interact with ears. The most simple version of this, obviously, is that some of us have ears that are more pinned back and flat against our heads, and some of us have more protrudy ears.
Sticky.
And the latter, yes. And the Dumbo-eared folks will have more tendencies to have that break seal on head, right? Mm-hmm. But it also changes the acoustics of the pad volume, right? And that's something where that interaction doesn't follow necessarily the difference between the two heads HRTFs. Like, depending on how something happens to sit on my particular ears, I might have a quite different sound just because the actual space in the ear pad is going to be differently shaped and differently sized than it would be with your ear.
Right, and there's also situations where, I mean, you briefly touched on this, but like the the wearing of the headphone itself actually impacts the pinna. Like it actually slightly, changes the shape. I've noticed this even when measuring headphones, that you get a different result. If you, this is why I generally shoot for a coupling that where the pinna isn't impacted if possible, right? But like there are definitely situations where I if I miss it, if I'm like, oh yeah, I'll try it again, the result itself can be very different. Which is, it speaks to that as well. But of course, at the end of the day, the viewer doesn't necessarily see that.
Well, yeah, and that's always why it's really important, and this is true for any scoring. This is true for anything that's derived from a measurement of a headphone that is not on your head. You have to understand that the experience that you have can differ purely for sound quality reasons. Like obviously there's the physical experience, obviously there's all the other stuff, but just from a frequency response standpoint, it will differ to some extent on your head.
Mm-hmm.
How much is the question, not whether, and it can be quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons that it's, and I say this, Constantine says this, everyone says this, I think, who is serious about measurements. It's really quite optimal to listen to a headphone yourself. Like you can usually tell from a measurement, this headphone is garbage. Like no personal interaction of fit is going to make me like an Bravo headphone.
Right.
But the same does not necessarily hold for this looks great, therefore I'm going to adore it. Like, I mean, that's exactly what we've had with The Expanse, right? Like, neither of us adore The Expanse.
Yeah, that's where I'm at with it. I don't adore it.
It's called being diplomatic, Andrew.
Yeah. This is not for me.
Yeah. Adoration level is very low.
Yes.
John Smith asks, what frequency ranges change the most? And here's the trouble. It varies. So for some designs, for example, for a planar magnetic headphone with a sufficiently low resonance frequency, you won't see a ton of variation down, maybe even down to 100 hertz. Like that whole range, even if you have a bunch of leak because you have big glasses or because your hair is giant or whatever, you still might not see much low frequency variation. But depending on how it sits on your ear, you might still see meaningful variations in the upper mid-range frequencies. And the very high frequencies, the stuff into the high kilohertz, it's going to be a crapshoot pretty much no matter what. All headphones are really variable with position there. For the same reason that your HRTF varies a lot with position there, that's where your wavelengths are starting to get close to the size of your ear. And so little adjustments change things a lot. By comparison, though, some headphones vary massively at low frequencies as well. Like, obviously, in-ear monitors are the cardinal example of this, right? Like, if you don't have the right ear tip and it's leaking, you may have no bass at all. Like, it may sound literally like,
yep,
well, a 5mm driver trying to play into the air next to your ear.
Or something with a high resonance frequency where you're getting a significant leak.
Yeah, in all those cases. So really, headphones can and do vary at, really, you should assume almost all frequencies. And the specifics of the design will limit that. And I personally think that that's a parameter that makes some headphones better than others, right? Like, I think a headphone that is less prone to losing all bass is better than one that isn't.
Right. Just to be clear, you mean headphones vary across heads?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the same headphone will be
yeah.
perceived differently on two different heads.
Yeah.
And that's not just because we have different preferences. It's also because we have different preferences, but it's not just because of that. And how much that happens will be variable. And that's something that we'd really like to look at. And right now we don't really have a way to look at that because you can't tell how much a headphone varies across X number of heads if you have one head.
Mm-hmm. So, and this gets into, a better interpretation of the data, essentially, to better make sense of how it might be across a wider range of people. Providing that data gives you at least some sense of this one is going to vary more based, compared to like what I see there, and potentially could be different compared, if you're comparing, say, an HD 600 versus an HD 800, or if you're comparing, say, Susvara against a Elegia, right? You can get a sense of which ones are.
A good example,
yeah, it's a good example. Yeah,
variable one.
Yeah. I was gonna go somewhere else with this as well. So this is essentially why we talk about HRTF and headphone to ear transfer function effects. And it's funny because like we talk a lot about HRTF and being like, oh yeah, there's everybody has there's a unique HRTF going on, but having an understanding of how significant the headphone to ear transfer function is, I think it's going to be super interesting. One thing that I think this isn't saying though is specifically that the common line of we all hear things differently, right? That's not what that's meant to be. However, it's an explanation for why people have different impressions.
And I mean, we all hear things differently is a phrase that is so general that it cannot be wrong. But at the same time, it also can't be meaningful.
It's a cop-out in my view. It's like,
Yeah,
if you want the conversation to end.
It's a thought-terminating cliche, as they say.
Yeah.
We are saying that you will perceive things a bit different, right?
Mm-hmm.
If two people put on the HD800 back to back, irrespective of their preferences, they'll probably hear it a little different. When I put on my HD800 on different days, it's a little different because if you shift it a little bit, it changes where the peaks are. Mm-hmm. So we all do experience, every experience of sound is novel to an extent. It's the same with speakers, right? With speakers, you're always in a little bit different of a position. Your head's a little cocked, you're a little moved back, forth, whatever. So nothing is ever the same twice. But that doesn't mean that there are not strong trends of what you perceive, right? The same speaker, the same sound, a guitar, your mother's voice, something that you've heard over and over, what that sounds like. Your experience of it every time is a little different, right? But you still have a strong perception of how it sounds and how it should sound. Mm-hmm. So I think that the premise that we are just all solipsistically in our own existence and that we all hear so differently that it's incomparable is really, that's what I'd really like to attack on that one. Right. And I think that's what you were gunning for as well.
Yeah.
Because it is solipsism, basically. It's saying, oh, my experience and yours can never be compared.
Yeah. But I do think there's so many different things going on when it comes to what people pay attention to, voluntarily or involuntarily, that sometimes that's where these conversations lead. I just get annoyed by the conclusion because it's not exactly satisfying. But in your view, just to get back to, showing variation, I don't know how we'll do this, but showing something to account for, HRTF and HBTF effects. How do you think that changes the way we should look at headphone measurements? So not you and me. I mean, like people who are looking at headphone measurements.
Oh yeah, not us, actual humans.
Yeah.
I think that in general, I mean, those are metrics that I would like to create, right? And the problem with a metric you would like to create is that you don't know what the actual correlations with perception are yet. Mm-hmm. And you don't know what sort of data you're going to get. So I don't want to sound like, oh, this is going to be the answer to anything, because we don't know that yet, right? This is something where there is a scenario. It's a weird scenario, but there is a scenario where we find a whole lot of nothing.
Yeah.
In the scenario where that's not the case, which I think is more likely, I think about this mostly in the context of risk. And that's how I think about it with headphones, right? Like, an open headphone has an open front, acoustically open headphone, has a lower risk of having a really variable perceived bass response than an acoustically closed headphone. A headphone like, for example, the AKG K371, a small leak in the front volume is going to change the bass response massively.
Yeah,
like
you might observe that in measurements too.
Of course.
Yeah.
And that's something that I really think we should have as something that we show. That's something I'm really glad that Ratings shows to the extent that they do. It's something that I'm really glad that Keith Howard of headphonetestlab.co.uk shows. Basically, how much will this headphone change if there is a slight but realistic leak in the ear pads? Mm-hmm. Because that shows basically the risk of what you get is not what you see. And I think it's the same with the ear, right? Like, you might be the one for whom this one just is bang on perfect, right? Mm-hmm. But if a headphone is highly variable and the ways that it varies aren't correlated with the particular ear, well, then your perceptual experience might vary a really large amount from the reviewers, right? Like that's something where the reviewer might have had a horrible experience, but you might have a good one. But conversely, the reviewer might have had a good experience and you might have a horrible one. And
Right.
that's a risk that you have to take if you're going to get a more variable piece of equipment, from my point of view.
And people need to know this, that that they're taking that risk. I think there's no scenario where we find a whole lot of nothing with respect to bass leakage, because with certain
that's
headphones,
physically impossible.
yeah, exactly. But it's how much that affects, how much it might be a situation where there's only like, where the majority of, let's say, audiophile headphones don't vary that significantly.
Which I would also find surprising, to be honest.
Yeah, I would as well. having having done measurements where I've seen the effects of even slight positional changes. Yeah,
And honestly, I think positional variation is something that's also worth looking at. Like that's something that I've gotten into arguments because some people don't like the idea of, well, sealed headphones can sound very pleasant, by the way, Tyson. It's not that they are always, and open headphones can sound horrible. It's just open headphones sound more consistent.
yeah,
So, but no, what I was going to say is the variations in positioning is something that would be really good to capture. I know that some people don't like the idea of capturing averages of positions, and I think that's a good, actually, I think that's a good criticism because, I don't frequently wear my HD800 like this.
yeah. This
For obvious
was something,
reasons.
if I remember correctly, Tile was into doing like backwards, forwards, and stuff, and I thought,
Yeah,
doesn't
he
make
always
sense.
did an average of a bunch of,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I get why he did that, right? Like it's a standardization that makes sense. What I think is more preferable is to show the range of real variation
Yes.
that can happen, because that is an important thing to know, and what the response looked like on actual heads. And that's one of the reasons that I'm really kind of particularly keen about the idea of having mics in human ears, is that you can actually know, for this person, this was comfortable. This is what sounded okay to them. This is what was right for that person.
Mhm.
And then you can know how that looked there. And that's a data point we don't get right now. We try to approximate it with placing realistically on our hats, but we don't quite get there always.
Mhm. Yeah.
Although of course with the hats, the solution is try to place it in a relatively sort of naturally fitting position, and you do your best.
I tend to think a good way to illustrate that is to have someone else put headphones on you and see if they get it right.
Ooh, yeah. If anyone ever wants an experience of what it's like to try to put headphones on a hats, try have someone just silently sit there and put your headphones on them, and then ask them if you did it right, and they will say no.
Yeah, or have them do it for you, and
Yep.
you'll get the experience, right, of of the significance of that. Jumping a little, you mentioned it briefly, but or you touched on it briefly, but I think we can get into some spicier topic here, which is your stance on reviewer targets.
Okay, so and I do want to be so this one. Okay, we've got to introduce this. So, what for the folks who are not keeping up with drama, one of the things that I have said that is an unpopular opinion is that I don't think reviewers should have individual targets.
I've said
So
this as well. I've echoed this essentially.
Yeah. And a lot of people take that reasonably, though incorrectly, as saying that spicy but not about DAQS. We'll do a stream on DAQS where it's just me, Resolve, and Cameron talking about this,
That was
and we just
spicy.
disagree the whole time.
Yeah.
Comment in our Discord if you'd like to see argue the whole time about DAQS stream. But so the concept is, oh well, this is saying people shouldn't have individual targets, right? And that's not, or individual preferences, and that's not it, right? We know people have individual preferences. Oh, there's a question there I really want to answer. I'm going to get back to you, JP Knox. So, but that's not actually quite it. It's that when people make these reviewer targets, there's sort of two problems here. One is that they are painting, they're basically both building and painting the house at the same time, if you think about it that way. The response of the ear, the HRTF, whatever you want to call it, the ear gain, is the foundational structure of how we hear tone. And that's something that's really not that likely that you want to change them. But the color of the sound, if you will, the whether it's warmer or brighter, that one we know there's quite a lot of variation in preference, and it makes a ton of sense to have that involved. For this reason, and in fact, I'm actually opposed to how we show our data. Funnily enough, so the
which is why we're changing that.
maybe
Ideally,
are we?
Yeah.
Are we? Have you finally listened to me?
What do you? The limitation for us is RU, from my understanding.
No, I mean I don't want us to show. I want our targets to be separated from the HRTF.
So from my my thought on this is that we're going to be showing it with preference boundaries, but for the moment they're going to be static. That's where I think the slight discrepancy.
We're getting into
that's
that
a
one's
thing.
getting a bit.
Yeah.
So what I have proposed to Andrew in the past is, we have a general idea of where the perception of sound is coming from on headphones, and that's nowhere, right? Like that's why the diffuse field target was proposed. That's why the Harman target still looks like a diffuse field HRTF rather than any of the other directional HRTFs.
Harman in room.
Well, all of them. Like if you look at the shape of the ear,
Gain, it
is different for frontal. It's different for 30 degrees.
Yeah.
It's different for every other incidence. What Harman looks like is diffuse field because it includes a lot of reflections. Because in-room listening includes a lot of reflections.
Yeah.
So what I've always said is, well, it's not really intuitive to draw a new ear peak, and it's very, very common for people to make changes in the process that are really, really impactful in our perception of sound. Like if someone had a speaker target that just had like a 10K peak that went straight up 10 decibels, or like at 4K it just dipped 10 decibels, you might be like, that seems like kind of a strange target. I'm not sure that quite agrees with me, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But in headphones, because we have the HRTF in there, we have this big ear gain peak, it can hide those effects pretty effectively. And so you can end up with something where if it matches the reviewer's target, if you compensate it to a different target, it's going to look very different. Often in a pretty narrow bandwidth. And those things do matter. So my proposal has generally been, I think that people should generally use a target that is basically what they would use for speakers, right? And it doesn't have to be the exact same EQ they'd use for speakers, but a target that looks like a target for speakers. And a target for speakers looks like, well, the output of EQ APO, right? So you can just see directly, this is boosting X frequency, this is cutting X frequency, what have you. And then I think that measurements should be compensated to diffuse field HRT, because diffuse field HRTFs exist for any head-like system, right? They're specific to a device. They allow us to compensate for any eccentricities of that device.
And you think that should you think that should be represented with a downward tilt for compensated data?
Well, if people prefer a downward slope, and people do prefer a downward slope for speaker in-room measurements, and people do prefer, if you separate the in-room HRTF measurement in Harman from the filters, people prefer a downward slope with Harman. Yeah. In general, that's probably the case.
I think as many people know here, my only contention there, where the disagreement I think is that I think that that's more challenging for new people to understand. The downward tilt aspect of compensated results versus building that slope into the, hence the sloped DF,
So your concept is basically that good should be flat.
Good is familiar as flat. So I understand why you would want to do it just straight to flat diffuse field, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but is there a version of Oratory's data that shows it like this, where the compensated data is with a tilt?
If there is, I have never seen Oratory do this. I have done this before.
Okay. I may be thinking of that then. But
Yeah,
for,
I don't think that that's been done much. You might see someone, if you go back far enough, you might see examples of people overlaying cinema target curves or room
right.
targets onto headphone measurements, and that might
Yeah.
be what you're.
I just tend to think that, there are many different ways to be able to make sense of a compensated graph if you spend enough time understanding how, what's gone into the representation of it. But for people who aren't going to bother to take the time to do that, I think that it is a bit jarring. Now, I could be totally wrong about that,
I
but
mean,
this is my assumption.
yeah, I think that that's one of those things where I'd really like to, particularly because I'd really love to have Constantine Oratory 1990 on for this as well, because this is one where he disagrees with me, but he takes it to a conclusion I'm not sure you'll like.
Okay.
So Constantine's position, I hope I'm representing him correctly, is we should be compensating headphone measurements to the Harman target, right? Because we know
Hmm.
people prefer the Harman target, and if we compensate to that, then it just shows the error.
Hmm.
His position is further, we should be compensating, the projected in-room speaker response you get from a spinorama.
Hmm.
He thinks we should compensate that to the Harman in-room preferred response from Olive 2013.
With filters or without?
So the speaker in-room response is just downward sloping
With
because it's just the
Yeah.
filters.
Okay.
So
Okay.
he's saying that a speaker that was flat in room should look like it's angling up, and a speaker that is downward slanted in room should look flat because that's preferred.
Okay.
Now, to my sensibility, that's a bit far. Um, I get it. It has the problem that if you ever change your standards, now you have a whole bunch of data that you can't as well compare it to unless you reprocess all of it.
Hmm.
I really would like to be in a position where we can all disagree on what we think things should sound like, to the extent which is, individual to our preference, right? Like you like meaningfully less treble than me, maybe as much as 4 dB less treble than me. Um, I would want us both to be able to exchange data in a way where it looks perceptually relevant to us, but we don't have to recompensate it on the other side. You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. I think we're in agreement with that. I'm not opposed to the idea of compensating to Harmon for any of this stuff, but
Well,
but
so your position would be that we compensate. So, like, if we do, if the headphone show becomes the speaker show,
yeah.
we'll need a better name. But if the headphone show becomes the speaker show, would you be, on board with, when we show predicted in-room response, should we show it with the compensation for preferred in-room response?
I'm of the opinion that the advantage of doing it the way we're doing it is that it makes it backward compatible with standard or well, understood at least speaker responses.
Well, yeah, I mean,
And
like,
to change that would be difficult. Would make things more difficult. Yeah.
I would agree.
Yeah.
And I think also forward compatible, right? Like the
Yes.
thing is, doing that is agnostic to what your target is, because your target just becomes something that gets overlaid. And there are reasons that this has problems, right? Like we've gone over this before. Maybe it's something we should rehash here. The sign illusion means that if you have two overlaid lines that do not perfectly track each other, your ability to estimate the difference between those lines is not actually as good as you might think.
Mm-hmm.
So there's reasons to
I've
compensate
experienced
exactly
that firsthand. I know exactly what that like. There's so many times I'm like, wow, I didn't realize that was so significant of deviation.
Well, and particularly, it's like when you have two things that are rising, but it starts at different frequencies, or falling, but it starts at different frequencies.
Yeah.
It will look like a much different difference than it actually is. Wow, different difference. Wow. My English has gone out the window today.
Solving all the solutions. So I want to get briefly back to reviewer targets because I have a slightly different qualm with it, although it's related. The qualm is that while my qualm is more a semantic one, right? If they, instead of calling it a reviewer like target, they just if it was somehow able to be communicated as, hey, by the way, this is kind of what I like, to give people an ability to sort of calibrate their understanding of what the reviewer likes. I think that's actually fine. But the issue that I have with it is a judgment about the product as it relates to that for other people. based on deviations from that individual target. And the reason for that is because of what we know about the widest, even the largest group. There were preference segments among that. And so that's kind of where I have an issue with it, where there's no preference boundaries shown. I mean, for us, we don't show preference boundaries because Rue sucks, but like, at least not yet. We will, but the point being that like it doesn't factor in essentially the widest, our understanding of what the widest range should be, and at least when you have something that's based on the research essentially, whether we're talking using Harman or an interpreted slope, let's say, like what we're doing, at least then it's based on not just, it's based on more than just one person's preference essentially. So that's where I land with it.
If I may push back on that one, I think
Sure.
it's useful to know what the preference of the person whose review you're reading is.
Yeah,
Right?
that's what I said at the beginning, right? So like I think this is why I think for me it's more of a semantic issue. If there's a way to communicate that, that's, I think that's useful at the very least. But I don't think that's commonly how they're used.
Well, and I think that it's easy to interpret things like this is one of this, and this is really a sign illusion problem, right? If you overlay, let's say Anthony's target, Android's target, with the Harman target with a raw in-ear, with a raw IEM response, you're going to get a quite busy graph.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing how things differ can be pretty problematic.
Right.
But if you just took, like, the difference between Anthony's target and DF, compensated the measurement to DF, and threw that and the slope into the thing along with the compensated headphone measurement, well, then you have three lines that are probably going to have a much more clear trend and aren't going to be going up and down and up and down. And I think that will be a lot more palatable to people, showing multiple targets or showing multiple ranges that way.
I mean,
it's one of the reasons that I'm pretty ardent about that being a good idea.
Yeah. I still think that gets a bit challenging for new people, but there's
Well, I think the big thing is I don't think new people should really be shown
those anyways.
I think his mic is much better than my mic.
Oh.
Tyson, let us know if that's a problem, by the way, because I do have other mics I can use. This was sort of put together pretty rapidly.
Well, also you're on Discord and they're getting the full.
Oh, that's true.
they're getting the full resolve with
That's
the RE20.
True. They're getting the uncensored resolve.
Exactly. Is there anything else you want to say on that? And then we can get into some Q&A and spicy hour. Spicy
Well,
half hour.
actually, there's a few more things I want to talk about MDAQS, actually, but just
Sure.
to close out the reviewer target thing.
Yeah.
I really would like to see us get into a space where the way we're representing data is... Oh, wait, no, I got completely thrown off what I was going to say. I was going to say, I don't think we should be showing these data, like a frequency response plot, to a new person. Like, I think that we should be showing them a much simpler proxy for tonality.
Oh, yeah, like a sound signature.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I think that's going to be much more meaningful to them than these plots.
Yeah, I agree.
For just generally how we view things, I'd really like us to get to a space where, having 10 plots on the same chart isn't completely busy. So we can say, oh, well, this is the headphone, this is, some of the variations of the headphone, this is preference, this is the variations of the preference, this is my preference. And I know that sounds like a tall order, but I actually really do think that if we're clever about it, we actually can get a lot of information like into a 2-axis plot in a way that's actually intuitive to read.
It does sound like a tall order, but I will say, just to bring this back to MDAQS, because I agree with you, that'd be great. But there is a sense in which doing so makes frequency response, makes reading a graph a little bit more descriptive, or at least a little bit more nuanced. Yeah, you went briefly blue.
I went blue?
Yeah, on my screen.
Dabba-dee, dabba-die?
Yes.
Blue
So
is the house.
yeah, so you mentioned you want to get back, just circle back on MDAQS a little bit.
Right. So MDAQS has one thing that I really like about it, which we didn't talk about, which I would like to talk about. So I mentioned earlier that what Sean Olive did when he was doing PPR was PPR is a 100 point ish scale, right? Where 100 is theoretically the best sound, and things can score above that because models are imperfect. But people rate things on a less than 100 point scale, even when you give them 100 points, right? No. All right, well,
Yep.
like
No.
if
Yeah.
you
This
give
is
people
tacit
like
agreement.
yeah, if you give people like 7 sodas, even if one of them is terrible, they're not going to say it's a 0.
Mhm.
They're going to say, "Oh, that's like a 30."
It's the what is the problem of relational differences?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Sean's solution to that was, well, he just normalized lowest equals 0, highest equals 100, and then, expanded the scale that way.
Hmm.
So the thing that was interesting that they did that was completely different is when Head ran into that problem, they were like, well, maybe this is the wrong listening test design entirely. And I found that really cool. So what Head did is they didn't actually do just, oh, give it a number score and we'll compensate for you. They were like, well, maybe that's not how we should do the listening test at all. They instead did a bunch of comparative listening tests. So instead of saying, oh, here's, your high anchor, your low anchor, and the thing you're listening to, they were just like, here's two samples. Is sample A, you know, slightly better, much better, or massively better than B, or vice versa? So it's a 7 point scale from sound the same to A is massively better than B, and B is massively better than A. And what's interesting about that, and this is something that Schaefer I think brought up in his video, I really recommend people watch it. It's only about 30 minutes, and it's really good. Um, is that this allows them to test for preference transitivity, which is something that actually isn't tested in the Harman stuff. Like there's a scenario where, and when I say transitivity of preferences, what I mean is scenarios where, for example, I prefer an HD 600 to an M50X and an M50X to an MDR V6, which I'm not saying I necessarily do, but whatever. But somehow, because of that, I necessarily have to prefer the HD 600 to the MDR V6, right?
Right.
Because I prefer it to something that I prefer to it. But the thing is, if I'm measuring the wrong things, if I'm looking at the wrong variables, I can get scenarios where the noise just causes it to bounce back and forth. And that's what they directly controlled for by saying, basically doing a round robin thing where they said,
Right.
for each of these things being A or B, which one do you prefer? And they made sure that they weren't including any noise data that way, which was very cool. Um, in fact, I'd really, really love to see more data on MDAQS's actual correlation with other listening tests. Like that's the only thing that stops me from being super hyped about it just as a new way to look at FR and preference is we really need, from my point of view, to see a case where, particularly for a model this complicated, it gets completely new data, like a completely new set of listeners, a completely new set of systems,
Hmm.
and we see if it still holds up in correlation. Because you have all these really interesting experimental design elements. Like that is just probably a better way to do if you have the time. If you have the time, that's probably a better way to do a listening test, right? And the problem with that, and the reason Sean didn't do that, is that means that you have to listen to every possible pair of two things, right?
Right.
Which, if you have 28 headphones, that's a lot of possible pairs.
Yeah.
But that's still something where a lot of stuff we're thinking about, right? You and I,
Hmm.
it would probably be quite suitable to do it that way, and that's probably a better approach than just giving people, having people score it. Um,
Right.
anyway, I guess that was the main thing I thought was cool. The other cool thing is the corelograms. I'd really again watch Schaefer's thing. It's really good, but it may make no sense for headphones, but it's super cool for car audio. So I
Right.
really think that if you ever have a chance to compare cars on MDAX score in the future, take it extremely seriously. Like even absent further evidence, it has a lot of good fundamentals there, and I think that it's just a good idea. And I know that I've been like, well, MDAX isn't that great, but that's specific to the headphone context. I want to be clear about that.
Cool. Yeah. Um. Yeah. All super interesting. I think we could get into some Q&A and some spicy hour. I know there was a question you wanted to address about occluded ear canal stuff.
Righto. So quite some time ago, JP Knox, who I hope is still listening, asked if the proximity effect is a problem with block canal microphones in human ears. And he was answered in chat correctly. The proximity effect only occurs with cardioid or directional mics, and it's because the wavelength of sound gets long enough to go around, so it's both sides of the pickup pattern. However, I do want to just specifically say the reason we're not worried when we have a block canal mic about extrapolating how that correlates with what we perceive at the eardrum is because if your microphone is close enough to the ear canal entrance, and it is omnidirectional, which so not cardioid, it's going to pick up sound in the same way as your eardrum is because it's a pressure detector, right? And your eardrum is also a pressure detector. And the ear canal is just a long tube, and that tube isn't directionally significant in audio band frequencies. So what happens at the entrance of your ear canal with a pressure detector directly tells you what happens at the end of your ear canal with a pressure detector.
Now, is that to say that the acoustic impedance isn't going to have a nonlinear effect?
No.
Okay.
So this isn't about impedance. This is just about like
it's the behavior of the headphone that you're talking about being the same.
Well, it's the behavior of okay, so what I'm saying is for a given pressure at the ear canal entrance, we can predict the pressure at the eardrum.
Yeah.
This breaks down when there is significant acoustic loading, and that's true. So that's why block canal mics have a flaw, right? With the block canal mic, you don't have the acoustic impedance of the ear. You just have the acoustic impedance presented by the ear pad volume and the concha.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not quite... for some headphones, that will result in the frequency response changing.
Right.
And that's a meaningful thing. And that's separate from the question of can we accurately capture eardrum SPL, basically, even though the microphone capsule is closer to the headphone or speaker or whatever than our eardrum is, which is, I believe, what JP was asking.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, your point there is that you can predict it, right, from the occluded ear canal mic.
So long as the load of the canal is not a significant portion of the load. Once that becomes a significant portion of the load, then you have a different effect that you have to deal with.
Do you have an example of a headphone where that would be the case, or a situation where that would be the case?
I mean, really any headphone that's like got a very small ear pad, like maybe like an HD 25 as an example, like a small on-ear ceiling. That would be one where I'd really expect you to see a meaningful impact because like the longest dimension in that volume is actually the ear canal because the ear pads are so small.
Right. Gotcha. That was always one where I always thought like, is that actually going to be predictive? Like I always thought there was going to be some additional variable, but that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that if it's possible, open canal is preferable.
Right. I mean, they obviously don't look the same, just apples to apples. but
there's a static function that defines that relationship.
Yeah. I got you. Very cool. Guys, we're in spicy hour now, or spicy half hour, let's say. If you guys have questions, what's that?
Sorry, my autofocus sent me to fuzzy hour.
Yeah, spicy fuzzy hour. Guys, drop your questions in the chat or in the chat here, and we will get to them. Make sure they are either about MDAQS, about just headphone measurement stuff in general, or in particular the spiciest of spicy questions. Let's go. If you see any, feel free to jump on them. I see here, raw is meaningless to most new people because it differs by measurement rig. It should be DF compensated and Harman preference compensated instead of current common system of raw plus target.
Blessed take. I vote this man.
I don't see any issues with that. See, the thing with raw versus compensated, because we do get this all the time, right, is a lot of people, I think, appropriately want raw, and I can count myself among them, for the specific purpose of wanting to know what the target is that's being used, right? But if that is stated and understood any other way, then compensated is clearly better. Like if you just say this is compensated to Harman, right? You don't need to actually visualize what that that curve looks like. And that's really what people like, from my perspective at least. That's really all that's there to be gained from a raw measurement. Anything else? Let's see.
Okay, so Scott Tharler asked, and I think this is quite a good one. Ultimately, what's the end game here? That we model what sounds good, and we can predict from measurements what a particular person will like or may want to buy? That's an interesting question. I think that one will vary by who you talk to, right? At the start of this, sorry if I'm jumping on this before you,
No,
Andrew,
go ahead.
at the start of this, I said I wouldn't really recommend buying headphones based on just PPR or MDAQS, even if they do correlate well with sound quality. Um, to some degree, I think PPR is kind of what it says on the tin, right? It's predicted preference rating. It's how likely it is that a representative listener will rate this headphone about this well, which maybe means that you'd want to buy it. Probably means, if you know that you fall very close to the median in terms of preference, it means that it's probably going to sound pretty good to you. It's not the holistic score that says you should buy this over that, though. Like, there are a number of headphones and earphones that I own because their ergonomics were superior, because I got a good deal on them, prices vary.
You like the way they look. You listen with your eyes.
I haven't had that one as much, except for the HD800. I love how the HD800 looks.
What about the Rode headphone?
Ergonomics. Straight
Really?
up ergonomics. Yeah, I really find the Rode NTH100 quite comfortable, and it's a cheap, comfortable closeback, which is for me all I wanted.
Fair.
So yeah, I would say that, from my point of view at least, what we want in these scores is a proxy for how likely is someone to prefer the sound of this. And that itself might be an input to a model that says how likely is it that someone wants to buy this, or that might just be something we give to people as a standalone. This is how likely you are to prefer this one to this one. I think that these scores should be, as I said, taken with a grain of salt, and you really have to ideally listen to stuff, if you can, first, or take advantage of a website that has an extremely friendly return policy, specifically because we acknowledge the human variations in our interactions with headphones.
Yeah. So just to sort of keep running with that concept of what the end game is here, I think one of the issues, and I don't know yet if this is true, but I have my sort of conjecture here would be that the way people read graphs right now is kind of like it's kind of like a statement of truth about the product. And they'll read into that target compliance. I'm not talking about you specifically. I'm just saying there's a general kind of way that people read graphs. And from my perspective, at the very least, what we can do with showing data on different equipment, different test equipment, different heads, essentially, is make sure that default position of reading headphone graphs changes slightly to include this is the truth in those conditions. And if you change the conditions, like it would be the case if you were to wear those headphones, there's a potential for that truth to be slightly different. That's not to say there's two different truths. Truth is the truth, but like what you're seeing in a graph is with that particular condition. So it's just like adding an kind of like an additional, it's giving you a higher res data to that statement, if that makes sense. That's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, and I'd like to say, I think one of the things that we're aspiring to, at least that I'm aspiring to, and things we want to measure, is things that add question marks to those PPR scores, right? How does this headphone vary on different heads? How does this headphone vary with leakage? Those are things that I think we should be, and maybe even you make it into a score that says this is your risk factor.
Yeah.
If we were really slick, we could probably manage that. But not everything has to be a score, right? But So the goal here would be to give people tools to better choose things, right? And one of them is a model that says, okay, you're likely to like this if your preferences are such and such. And I'd like to see it so we could have it be adjustable. Maybe make a model where you could input the headphones that you like,
Hmm.
and it would use some of the same mathematics, but it would base it on their target response. Um,
That gets a bit weird because it's like people like headphones for all kinds of different reasons. Like,
exactly, it would have to be headphones that you like the tone of,
exactly.
basically.
Yeah.
Um, so, but I think that really what we aspire to is to make information more useful to people who want to get audio products, right? Like that's kind of what we're at its core looking for.
Yeah.
Um,
Just to make it more useful for people. Yeah.
yeah,
Make it easier to navigate this craziness.
yeah,
Um,
because right now it's hard as heck to find stuff
yeah.
you like.
Yeah. And
I had a pile of headphones that I bought, and I was like, ugh.
like given the way that like the current headphone measurement kind of culture works, it's like I I regularly find situations where, I mean, it goes back to what we've said before, where you can get a general picture, but I have strong preferences within the, sort of the acceptable range, for frequency response. And I think people do as well. So I think getting a bit clearer on what that could be is a good thing. Um, let's go to another question here.
Just a quick one. JP Knox asks,
I see it.
what conditions affect the pressure
I
at
think, yep,
the? Presumably that was about the in-ear mics.
yep.
Um, for something that's like a speaker, something that has a very low acoustic output impedance, uh, there's not going to be a variation in pressure based on whether your canal is open or not. For something where you have a small high resonance frequency source very tightly coupled to your ear, your canal will be a significant portion of the air that is the load that it is driving, if you want it in the electrical equivalency. So basically, ear impedance matters more as your drivers become, well, a good proxy is how dependent they are on being sealed to your head. It's not 100%, but that's a good proxy. So that's the quick answer.
Right.
Cello asks, are AirPods Max non-minimum phase? Those have a head tracking mode, right?
I actually don't remember. I know they have. I know they have crazy. What is it? The spatial audio when you're using like say you're watching Apple content, specifically. Um, it makes things crazy spatial. I think they even just call it spatial audio. But whether that includes head tracking, I'm not. Yeah.
If they have spatial audio, they're non-min phase.
Okay.
No, that doesn't mean they're always non-min phase, but at least while they are reproducing things with an HRTF model, with an HRTF model in a room with sound sources, they are non-min phase.
Right. That's actually very interesting. Let's continue here. Okay, listener, let's see what this is. Now that we have more
Wow, this is favoritism. You skipped over like two people.
I know, but but he put the little peppers in, so I was drawn to it. Now that we now that we more specifically know the parameters of Harman's IEM testing, I presume this is from the interview with Dr. Olive at CanJam. We should organize more trained listeners, which wasn't many to begin with, and make a better IEM target. Okay, to springboard off of that, what do you think of that, of Crin's sort of theory or hypothesis there about the Harman IE target and why it might be an outlier?
His hypothesis being that they didn't give people the ability to adjust the treble and that messed things up.
Yeah. Now, I do think the assumption is a good one, and it took me a bit to realize that. Why would you have a different starting point for IEMs, right? But I guess his charge is more if you approached it with the same rigor as with over-ear headphones, the result would potentially be different.
I think that's an interesting question.
And specifically,
I'm not. Yeah.
Just to clarify, that is a slightly different explanation for why this target is different, or is what it is, than what Jude gives, which is based on it's located more at the coupler level.
I mean, I think that there's probably Well, I think both serve as nuisance variables to analyzing the other. So to some degree, it's hard to figure it out because, like, we know that IEMs are load impedance dependent,
Mhm.
right? And we know that the 5128 has a more accurate Z than the 711 couplers. The 36, wow, 6318-4. That's it. 60318-4
Right.
couplers. I'm losing my mind. The question of how much each variable plays a role here is really hard from my point of view to ferret out. Like, I think it would be interesting to do a replica of those tests using measurements of the headphones in, and ideally this would include a test headphone that has a microphone in the front volume. So measurements in the coupler, the 711 coupler, in the B&K type 4620 coupler from the 5128, and in people's ears, and then figure out, what are people actually wanting when these things are allowed to be adjusted. And I think that would probably, I think that basis will make it pretty easy to see whether, if you just restrict them to adjusting bass level, that's, the determining factor, or that's a determining factor at all. I would not be surprised if, I mean, it would surprise me if people didn't crank bass higher when they don't have the option to turn down treble or mids. So I think that Prin's concept there is credible, but figuring out how you should go, like where you should go from there, is really hard without just doing another test.
Yeah, like I suppose it's if you imagine you had time and resources to do another test, would you and where you gave people the same controls essentially, um, do you think the result would be different?
That's a good question. Um, I, based on what we've seen from the Harman stuff, my suspicion is that, so there was one Harman test where on average they didn't change the treble much, I will say. So that is something that happened once. So there is a scenario where you gave them both controls and they still did not adjust the treble.
Are you talking about the one that they did like with their internal panel?
It was 2015.
Okay.
So the one that produced the 2015 target has no net adjustment to the treble in my memory.
Okay.
Or if it does, it's a very, very small one, like sub 1 dB.
Right.
So it could happen that you put the experiment together again, you give them bass and treble controls, and they only adjust the bass.
Right.
But that would surprise me a bit. I think that would be an unexpected result, but so I think in general what I'm saying is I think that Kryn probably has the right idea. I'm just not sure if that's the totality of what's going on.
Okay. Yep. That's fair. Um, yeah, it's funny because like I was sort of holding both of those ideas in mind and chatting with Jude about it at CanJam, thinking, which one is more likely to explain this result. Not thinking necessarily that it could be a combination of factors.
Yeah. No, and I mean it's almost always like that's the really annoying thing about science, is that variables are very annoying about not isolating themselves.
Yeah. Um, just to go back a little bit, the ones that I skipped over, like the asshole that I am. How's the ABX testing of amps going? Can you reliably distinguish, for example, topping A90 from the ZL HM1? I have not done that. We do have the ABX tester. I have used it on occasion, and what it has revealed to me is that I also don't care about DAQs and amps generally, as long as they're not, there's not something wrong with them. Because in the situations, like it, basically, I'd be able to guess, if I were to be able to guess, which is which correctly 6 out of 10 times, that doesn't tell me anything about, it doesn't tell me anything really. It just means that, there's not a significant enough of a difference. You know what I mean? So,
Well, and for small differences, you can add trials to get a statistically high confidence that you do hear it.
well,
But
yeah,
I get what you're saying, which is that even if you did, you wouldn't care if you only hear
exactly,
it
exactly.
60 and 100 times.
Yeah. So, specifically with the ones that I tested, it was with, at the time, I believe it was with one of the shit audio amps and the topping A90, and there was no way that I was going to be able to tell a difference there. And I believe it was with the A90 and the Bioelectric. I believe I did that one too, and the same thing, essentially. But that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be. My line on this has tended to be that, just because that's the finding there, that doesn't mean that that there wouldn't be differences in situations where we should expect them to be there. Like, for example, output impedance, high output impedance on the amplifier with nonlinear impedance on the headphone. So conditions of the headphone may and conditions of the amplifier may affect this. And other situations,
Yeah,
like,
I
for
think
example,
implicitly
tube amps.
he means, like, I think implicitly, given the Zale is the,
Let's say low
reference
impedance.
point,
Yeah,
he means,
yeah.
he means a transparent amp
Yeah.
compared to a transparent amp.
Yeah. Now, I will say, in both of those cases, they measure well enough to where you would expect not to hear any distortion, and you would expect to not hear any noise. Well, obviously, unless you're plugging in a Campfire Andromeda. In the A90's case, if you're running it with single-ended RCAs. But yeah, and so it's a worthwhile experiment to do. So I do think at some point we'll need to do it. If I remember correctly, Golden also has an ABX tester, and he does use it. And I believe
So he has used it in the past.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have any content coming on that. I'd be very interested in seeing content, because he has posted some outlier results in terms of what he has differentiated.
Yeah. So I think we need to get more into that. The main thing for me is that, like, I basically, I don't have the audio precision, right? And so I'm not measuring amplifiers and source equipment, right? So Golden is the one who usually focuses on source equipment reviews.
Also, you don't want to review source equipment.
Yeah, because I generally don't find there to be a difference. but at some point, I think that is it's a video or a topic for us to explore on its own. Yeah, you briefly. Oh, it's because your screen. There's something on your screen that you're seeing, and that you're going all kinds of different colors.
There's something on my screen I'm seeing.
This should be the thumbnail of the video. That's terrifying. I can see out your window.
Wait, what? You could?
Yeah. So okay. Do you have any other spicy ones that you see here that you want to jump on?
There's a quick one. Why are Sonarworks measurements different from the ones I see on the show? Sonarworks has their own target curve internally, and they have had a number of atypical measurement systems over the years. Prior to talking to Oratory about this, I would have said that they were probably using a non-standard compliant measurement rig. As stands, I can't say that for a fact, and I'm sure that they have access to accurate or conventional ones, but they simply seem to use a meaningfully different target from everyone else.
Okay.
So, not comparable unless you know what that is.
I have a spicy question for you.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Olive's recent, I guess it's almost like experiments, but Olive from Olive's Gadgets, if you're familiar with them?
I mean, I'm familiar with him. I'm the guy who made his mics.
No, I know. but the recent thing that he's been doing is trying to equalize a sound signature to match, at least if I'm understanding it correctly, which I might not be, to match like sounds produced in nature, like nature sounds.
Yes, so what he's effectively trying to do there is just, this one I've heard quite a few times over the years. So he is attempting to equalize for accurate reproduction. And the thing is, we already know what the EQ for accurate reproduction is, right? It's the one where, let's say I have a speaker in front of me, because this is way easier than going and finding a waterfall that always sounds the same. I play a sweep through the speaker. There's a sound pressure at my ear entrance, at my eardrum, wherever, somewhere in the ear where sound is directionally invariant. I play back that sweep over a headphone, and I make sure that at that same point, the response is the same.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the criteria for this is the same sound. Now, the problem is, and this is something that's a problem that is inherent to headphones, without head tracking, I still won't hear it the same, because the moment I move my head, that waterfall is going to go with it, and that will change my perception of where sound comes from, usually to being inside the old dome, which is a problem. there's really no way around this, and there's no point in involving nature sounds. Like, I think that that's just. I'm not sure why Olaf is really fixated on that one, and I've tried several times over the years to explain that that doesn't make any sense to me.
The listener says teal moment.
Yes, it is a teal
But
moment.
although it's you touched on it briefly, the idea of accuracy versus preference, and he does
Yeah.
he delineates these things, and I'm wondering if you think there's any merit to doing that.
Well, in binaural recording, there is such a thing as accuracy, right? Like,
Hmm.
a binaural recording can be made that at my eardrum produces the same sound pressure that I would have experienced if I went to, that show or that recording of a deer dying in a forest glade or whatever. I don't know what people make binaural recordings of these days. Um,
Jesus
but where it,
Christ.
whatever the case, where it can literally be the sound pressure at my eardrum is the same, and that's not necessarily going to perceptually be exactly the same as being there for the aforementioned reasons, but you still can make a fidelity argument in the sense of if Blaine was literally there, or if Andrew was literally there, this is what they would have heard at their eardrums, and that you can actually create that.
Yeah.
Now, I personally don't think that's like there's not very much binaural content. It's very individual. Like a binaural recording made on my head will not sound as good to you as it does to me by any measure. So I think that it's a bit of a false messiah on this one, a golden calf.
Right.
But
What
that
about
is a case where accuracy does make sense as a concept because you really can reproduce something.
in the non-binaural case though? And
Oh, it makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, something has made you jolly. What are we talking about?
Sorry, it's just like people saying Jesus Blaine.
Oh. Yeah.
Listen, whenever I look into binaural recordings, it's all people saying, "Oh, I want to record nature sounds."
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I don't think this was intended to be, in a strictly to do with binaural stuff. I think it's more to identify, let's, and I think this isn't just Olive's conjecture. I think this is actually something that permeates, the audiophile hobby in general, that there is a difference between, accurate and, listener preference. And this is why it's one of the sort of, repudiations of the Harman research that it's based on listener preference, not accuracy. And yeah, I mean, if, what I'm getting is from you is that you think that makes no sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't make sense because there is, well, okay. We have this conversation, I think, every stream. We'll probably have this conversation every stream until the end of time.
Yeah.
There is a case where you are reproducing something, right, with stereo. And what you're reproducing is what was heard in the mastering engineer's chair, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that was the first time that recording existed as a stereo recording.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to, you can reproduce that. And you can reproduce that on headphones, you can reproduce that on speakers.
I don't think that's actually the case for accuracy that people mean it to be, but
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's what people want.
Yeah.
What people think is that there's some sort of actual original acoustic event, non-electronically, not through speakers, that happens somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Which for the overwhelming majority of all recordings that have ever existed or will ever exist isn't the case. Like there is not a point that you can stand or could have been stood in space somewhere that will give you the sound that that you want to hear, because it was a multi-channel recording or multi-track recording which had mics different positions. It was, even if you have an XY pair, you can't convert from an XY pair's recording to the sound of being there because it doesn't have the head shadowing effects, it doesn't have the HRTF effect. So it's impossible to get that kind of accuracy to being there when the instrument was played, when the singer sang, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
with a stereo recording.
I mean, in a sense, you can say it's just art all the way down.
I mean, I think reproduction is part of the art.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone asked if we think that there will. Sorry, let me just quote this properly. I scrolled down. Do you think all the things that we can measure, that we cannot measure now, will eventually be measurable? By Chef Steve.
And to add to that, I think there was a comment earlier from Chiron that frequency response doesn't tell you anything about dynamics and resolution.
So there's an interesting sort of there's an underpinning assumption, I think, or at least I read this as having an underpinning assumption that there are things currently we can't measure. Now, perception of X is something that we don't have a great way of measuring right now, right? Like perception of dynamic, perception of spatiality. And in those things, yeah, I'm dead sure that eventually we will be able to measure those. But when it comes to actually measuring the factors in sound that give us those impressions, we are already absolutely able to measure them. And we have been for decades.
Now, I mean, again, as you know, my take on this is that the limitation there is in our analysis of the existing metrics, right?
Precisely. Well, and of the existing data. Like metrics are built from data. A lot of metrics suck.
Yeah. But do you think? So, supposing we had a way to get a measurement of, let's get slightly to the MDAQS thing. Supposing we had a way to get a measure of the perception of these qualities, do you think that would, let's assume that the reason for it is because it's too hard to find that, or too hard to refine the analysis of the data to, accurately get that. Do you think that it's worth kind of just like going straight to trying to measure the perception of that with, say, a panel of listeners and saying, okay, which of these headphones have slam, or I don't know how you would construct it, but you get the idea.
Well, in general, when you're trying to come up with a measurable proxy for perception, again, excluding fMRI stuff here, what you do is you have a bunch of people report their subjective results. You try to test to some degree for the consistency and the coherence of those reports, and you look for if there are any measurable variables that have a correlation there, right?
Yeah.
So that's what MDAQS does, right?
Yeah.
Their whole concept was, people are saying this sounds immersively better than that, and then they looked at what seemed to correlate with that.
I still feel you're going to run into the Wittgenstein problem here a little bit.
Well, inevitably.
Yeah.
I mean, living means getting into the private language argument problem.
This is true. At a certain point, you have to be able to communicate something. Yeah. I suppose I just think I tend to think if you got a bunch of audio reviewers, like say if I picked a bunch of people who speak the same language, you would be able to get to a result that was reasonably predictive for other people who had that same interpretation of it. But beyond that, it gets really weird, and I feel I've become more and more acquainted with that the more conversations I have with people at audio shows, where it's like, oh, okay, you that's what you think of this headphone, okay.
Yeah, and that's an undercredited problem, right?
Yeah.
Like there's the assumption that when 5 people say dynamics, they mean the same thing, and I think that probably the answer is that for the majority of these perceptions, you would really struggle to get a meaningful body, maybe like say 20 people, to have a really consistent ranking of 10 headphones on these parameters.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that those aren't perceptually relevant, but it means that how we look for them differs a little bit, Yeah.
I've basically exhausted all the things that I want to talk about here, but if there's anything that you see from the chat or just anything that you want to get into, I think we have a little bit of extra time for that.
How spicy do we want to get? There's an argument about topping.
Let's go for it. I mean, why not?
Okay, so folks have been going back and forth a bit about topping, and I think the main people arguing are Tyson and
Hartue. Yeah.
So topping is a fairly divisive company in the audio industry, and I think that a lot of people dislike it for not necessarily the reasons I would, but I think Tyson is raising some reasonable criticisms and some criticisms I'd call kind of unreasonable. So I figured maybe this would be a time for both of us to talk about what we dislike and like about topping.
So I believe I need to mea culpa a little bit on this, only after doing the ABX. But that doesn't mean that I don't have issues with some of the topping products. the mea culpa is that I at some point, I don't know if this is actually public. There's a quote of me saying that the A90 makes me want to put rocks in my pockets and walk into the ocean. And it's it that comes from listening to doing a completely informal, listening with so not controlled, not blind, nothing. Comparing the Rebel, I think it was the Rebel amp and the A90, and I much preferred the Rebel amp. Now, at the time, I didn't have the ABX, and I wasn't doing that comparison. So maybe it'll turn out in the future, if I do that comparison with the ABX, maybe that will confirm, or it'll reveal what the truth of that comparison actually is. But after doing the comparison with some of the other products that were out there, where I didn't really feel there was anything meaningful there. I want to amend my opinion of the A90 to I still don't like it because of the ground loop issue.
Yeah, no. So that's where I think that it's very reasonable to complain about a lot of the design choices that Topping makes. One of the complaints I'm seeing in there is that Topping used bad components. Having taken them apart, I don't really agree with that.
Well, you think they're actually quite well made.
Yeah. Okay, so
I was just gonna say one other thing on that. I think the other potential argument that I have against some of those products, it's not to say the brand itself, but they have many different products within their lineup that are basically all the same at different price points, that have the same function, that's maybe one scores slightly better on Synad, or has slightly lower imperceptible distortion or noise or whatever. People inevitably buy the one that scores better, even though there's literally zero difference to them other than the confidence that it scores better. So that's the other thing, but you could say that about any product, not necessarily just Topping products.
So, well, I mean, yes, absolutely. Like, what I see as a big criticism of Topping products is what Tyson started on his complaints about, and what is something you'll see in a few threads, which is a fair number of them have had destructive failure modes.
Oh yeah, the L30, I believe.
Not just the L30. I actually have several on my desk from different Topping lines that have all had destructive failure modes. From my point of view, that's just bad practice. Like, headphone amps really should not be in a position where instability should ever be a risk. Like, am I crazy? Like, my iPhone dongle is never going to smoke my headphones, right? Like, the standard that we hold the 1 cent or the $1 integrated circuit in there is so much. I have removed the knobs from all of those. Price fit knobs are whatever. Anyway, I'm not saying I like Topping. I'm in here complaining about Topping because I think that honestly it's really just not responsible design practice to design an amplifier that maybe is a bit lower distortion or a bit lower noise, but is potentially unstable.
Right. So that's what I was getting at a little bit, where it's like chasing that dragon and bringing with, like, if there's a scenario where that has nothing, that has no compromises on any of these other things, I don't really think there's an issue there. It's just an additional, it's another red herring to go after, right? But if there is a meaningful trade-off, that's not a worthwhile one to make.
Yeah, like, there's gonna be, and people are saying this quite reasonably in there. If you have X thousand units sold, there's going to be some lemons, right? And everything has lemons. The important thing with the design is making sure that if you have a unit that is either in an atypical circumstance or that is, defective in some way, it isn't going to cause a problem. And that's the area where a lot of amplifier designers historically have kind of not been great. Like, this isn't just a Topping thing. But really, that's something which should always be
Right.
off the table.
I
It's
mean,
not a common thing I want to stress because people are asking this now. Like, I don't have any evidence to suggest that this is something which is occurring at like a single percentage point level. But it shouldn't happen at all, and the design should be such that it cannot happen, in my view.
the shit audio Magni amp that we had blew up. Did we send that to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that did indeed burn the entire channel out, I believe. So,
Yeah.
like, that's. I really pretty strongly feel that you should not be. Like, maybe if someone says, oh, this is, this is the hot rodded, unsafe, drag racer version of this amp, maybe it's okay if it has that potential. I would consider selling that maybe, but for everything else, I think that you should just be safe saying that no matter what, my headphone amp, worst case, will stop working. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
So that's my complaint about topping, and that does also go for shit, as Tyson notes.
Yeah.
Um,
We should at some point have Golden in here to talk some of the addition, or to do an additional sort of like, amps and DACs stream, because I think you and I are fairly on the same page with this stuff. For me, I still enjoy tube amps. I think that's the difference. In certain conditions.
well, apparently
right?
we're going to have him on another stream soon because they're all voting yes on the "Do you want to see them argue about DAX" thing.
Oh, yeah, the DAX thing is an interesting thing for me because I don't have enough experience with R2R DAX, and I don't have enough experience with the what's the company that does the MPGA whatever. Sorry, FPGA.
MPGA?
something else.
Like
It's like
Chord.
miles per
You're
gallon.
thinking
No,
of Chord.
Chord. Yeah. I don't have enough experience with that equipment, and I have not done ABX tests with any of that stuff. So, and also, I feel we're in a different era now for DAX from where a lot of the inertia for commentary on DAX comes from. That's my sense, at least. People talk about ESS DAX as bright, AKM DAX as velvet, whatever, and Burr Brown DAX as warm. I don't know if there's any truth to that whatsoever. That comes from I feel that comes from somewhere else entirely, either because of just reviewer inertia or certain implementations of off-the-shelf chips that has led to one thing or another, and then they attribute it to those products. So
I think that it's mostly perceptual inertia plus some opportunely timed placebo effect myself. But I guess
right,
that's putting on the table that I'm not very much compelled by a lot of this.
yeah, I tend to think that there was that whole thing about the intermodulation distortion thing that people were talking about potentially being a contributing factor to
Intermodulation distortion thing.
they called it an IMD hump in the measurements.
Oh, yeah. So like the fact that the ESS stacks at like
Yeah.
minus 40 dBFS
Yeah,
have
yeah.
a slight increase in their nonlinearities.
Yeah.
I would be very surprised.
If that was even audible.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. See, I was thinking, if I listen to again, this is not without any ABX, so it's totally, who knows, right? But my sense of some of these older DACs was that they were not implemented the way that the DACs are today, and they may have had more issues in the past.
I mean, yes, but I'm quite dubious.
Yeah, I need to ABX them to actually, verify that the perception was correct.
Exactly.
Or, at least, verify some way.
This isn't spicy enough at all. And
No, it isn't.
The question listener keeps asking isn't very spicy either. I'm gonna go look and see if there's someone spicy here.
I'll briefly read this. Given the starting point for Harman 2016, no bass shelf, do you think most would choose use shelf to correct low mids or distinct bass shelf? Latter is more likely, IMO. I'm not quite sure what you mean about the difference between those two.
Yeah, echoing that confusion.
Use shelf to correct low mids. I I know we've been going for a while here, but I do have. He's asked it again. I do have
Oh
a
no,
question.
he asked that like 3 times.
Yeah, I do have a question about something that listener has worked on. Have you seen his interpretation of or reinterpretation of an IEM target based on that 400 hertz dip of the B&K? Or like
Yeah.
what how it's different there specifically? What are your thoughts on that?
I am a little bit skeptical there. I mean, like, really, well, from my point of view, attempting to transform a target for one ear Z to another ear Z doesn't make sense. So, which isn't to say that he's wrong, as such, so much as that I'm kind of dubious of the whole concept in
Mm-hmm.
general. Um, but I would ideally want to see us do more measurements of IEMs. And like, really, I think that the appropriate thing with IEM targets is something that uses the actual full range, higher accuracy ear sim. And there will always be, for the exact reason that there are differences between the 711s and the B&K, there will always be differences in how load responsive IEMs deal with different ears. So I think that there's going to be some inherent error there.
Right. So when we look at an IEM measurement on a B&K 5128 and compare it to when we look at common IEM measurements on the 5128 for like let's say well-regarded IEMs like the Blessing 3 or Blessing 2 or whatever, right? Like fairly normal-ish well-regarded IEMs. Compared to DF plus 10 dB or whatever, 12 dB for the slope, they generally look like they have a dip at around 400 hertz. And I suppose the question there is it that those IEMs are just more forward in, or is it that they should be more forward in that region? Or that they just can't be compared to the way that they look on Gross 711?
I mean, I think that it's at minimum the latter. The question of whether those IEMs are or are not that forward, I think, is probably a question for a listening test.
Oh, so that's a false dichotomy.
Yeah. That
Right,
would be
that's fair.
basically my position there.
Right. So we don't know the answer to that, right? So we're just basing it off of an assumption that, oh, yeah, this one has a dip at 400 hertz.
Yeah, I don't think that treating a system as having that kind of a fixed FR feature is advisable, all else equal.
Right. And when we're talking about the acoustic impedance of the human ear being, or the B&K being better at, representing that, we're talking below 200 hertz.
Well, they only match, actually, amusingly. They only match quite well in that range specifically.
Which, yeah. Yeah.
So, but of course, that can produce a difference specific to that range because everywhere else is different.
Yeah, right. That's fair. Yeah.
On that one, my general take would be, I don't really know.
Yeah.
There's a conceivable scenario there where there's something going on there, but there's also an equally conceivable scenario where we're just sort of looking at data noise, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We should have listener on the live stream at some point.
Yeah, I'm down for it.
Maybe we can have. I didn't see Jamie in the chat. Maybe we can have multiple people on here, and we can all be.
Oh, Jamie said earlier that he's not going to be around for this one.
Okay.
He's out and about.
Okay.
Boot in a boot.
Yeah, us Canadians. I think that's basically gonna do it for the stream. Unless you see any final thoughts, any last words of wisdom to impart for this week, at least, to our regular viewers and community.
It's an interesting question. Final words of wisdom. Buy headphones you enjoy and listen to music you like.
And there you have it. All right, that's going to do it for this live stream, guys. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Big thanks to Mad Economist for joining us. And
Also known as Blaine.
Also known as Blaine, yeah. And look forward to another exciting live stream, ideally next week. I was thinking maybe we could talk about some of the future content we have upcoming. We're going to be doing all kinds of stuff.
I'm still trying to get Sean on.
Yeah, but also we're working on a large project with many different couplers, and it's we're going
You
deep.
can see that in the background. Actually, there's a disassembled IEC coupler
Yeah.
visible as a little bonus.
Yeah, yeah. So hopefully this is going to bear fruit in the next month. To have these big projects kind of rolled out, and then some fun stuff as well with DMS and myself and Blaine as well, Madbot. So that's upcoming. And just one last thing, guys. If as mentioned at the beginning of this, if you haven't seen the MDAQS thing, check that out. I find it interesting. It's cool if you guys do, and let folks say hi. Say we sent you.
Well, no, don't brigade them.
I mean, you can brigade them.
Why?
It's. I think the MDAQ stuff is pretty cool. At least it's interesting. So yeah, and then also check out our Discord linked in the description below. Headphones.com for the audio files where we write provide our written material, and the forum as well.
And also headphones.com if you want to buy headphones.
Yes, also headphones.com if you are considering buying headphones. All right. Until next time, guys. I'll see you guys.